My name is Michael, and I will never forget the night when freedom slipped from my hands at 2 a.m. The kitchen floor beneath me was slick with my own blood, my right leg twisted into a grotesque angle that no human limb should ever endure. Pain shot through me in blinding flashes, but what carved deeper into my chest than the broken bone was the betrayal staring back at me. My stepfather's boot collided with my ribs again and again, each strike a drumbeat of cruelty, and just a few feet away stood my mother, the woman who had once sung me to sleep. Her arms were crossed tightly, her green eyes locked not on my suffering, but on my refusal. "Sign the loan, Michael," she said flatly, her voice foreign, stripped of the warmth I had clung to for 22 years. I begged, my voice fractured and desperate, but her expression remained unmoved. The blood in my mouth was bitter, but not as bitter as realizing that my mother had chosen greed over her own son. You might wonder how it ever came to this point. How does a mother stand idle while her child is beaten? How does family disintegrate into savagery? That is what I must tell you. But before I do, let me say this. Stories like mine are not just meant to horrify, they are meant to awaken. They remind us how fragile freedom can be when trust is surrendered to the wrong hands. And if you are watching this, I want you to know something. I am not just telling a story of pain, I am telling a story of survival. If you've ever been silenced, doubted, or betrayed by the very people who should have stood beside you, this story is for you. Stay with me, because the truth of how I ended up bleeding on that kitchen floor will reveal more than violence. It will reveal what it costs to take back your life. That night, the clock read 2:00 a.m. The world outside my house was quiet, but inside every second was a war. I pressed my hands against the tiles, trying to crawl toward my mother's feet, hoping that somewhere inside her the memory of who we used to be still lived. But she didn't move to help. She didn't even flinch. She just repeated like a cold echo, "You should have signed." And in that moment, a cruel clarity washed over me. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about power, about the surrender of dignity that had been building for years. My stepfather's fists were the final blow, but my mother's silence was the real betrayal. That silence was a cage one I had been forced into long before that night. So this is where my story begins, with bone-breaking pain, with betrayal, and with the realization that survival wasn't going to come from anyone else. It was going to come from me, or it wasn't going to come at all. I remember the taste of copper in my mouth as I tried to form the words, "Mom, please." My voice cracked, torn between desperation and disbelief. Blood slid down my cheek, mixing with the tears that blurred my vision. I reached toward her, hoping for the comfort I used to know the comfort of lullabies, of hands that once braided my hair, of a voice that promised the world would be okay. But instead of bending to help, she leaned closer and hissed, "You should have signed." That moment, more than the blows of Greg's fists, shattered me. You see, betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And when it comes from someone you love, it slices deeper than any blade. My mother wasn't just silent, she was complicit. Her folded arms were shackles, her silence a sentence. And I realized then that I was no longer her son. I had become an obstacle, a barrier between her and the life Greg promised, but never delivered. That truth burned worse than the pain in my broken leg. And yet as I lay there, I knew something else too. If I survived, my story had to be told. Stories like mine exist in shadows because people believe it could never happen in their family. But it does. And if you are here, listening, then you already know the importance of light in dark places. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you believe that silence should never protect cruelty, take a moment right now to subscribe and share this story. Your voice is what gives mine strength. When Greg struck me again, I felt my body lurch and I bit back a scream, afraid that showing weakness would only fuel his rage. But inside I was unraveling, not just from the beating, but from my mother's stare, the same eyes that once beamed with pride when I brought home good grades, now narrowed with disgust because I had refused to sacrifice everything for their scheme. I thought back to when Dad was alive. Back then, my mother and I were a team. We shared grief when he passed, leaned on each other through lonely nights. I was her anchor, and she was mine. But slowly, piece by piece, Greg chipped away at her independence, and by the time I realized what was happening, she had already surrendered herself to his control. That's the thing about manipulation. It doesn't storm in with fists. It creeps quiet and patient until you mistake chains for love. That night, as I begged her, I wanted her to remember who she was before Greg. The woman who once told me freedom mattered more than comfort, but instead, she chose him. And in choosing him, she left me to bleed. I don't tell you this to make you pity me. I tell you because silence like hers exists in more homes than you know. And the question is, if you were there, if someone you love was pleading at your feet, what would you do? Would you look away, or would you fight for them? I want to hear from you. In the comments, what does family mean to you? And how far would you go to protect it? Because for me, in that moment, family collapsed into a single realization. Blood is not always thicker than betrayal. My mother's refusal to save me wasn't just her weakness, it became my awakening. I knew then that my survival couldn't depend on her anymore. If I wanted to live, I had to reclaim my freedom myself. Greg may have held the power of fists, but my mother's silence gave me clarity. And clarity is dangerous because it awakens the fight within. The fight that says, even when the people you trust most betray you, your story doesn't end there. My story didn't end there. And if you stay with me, you'll understand why. When I close my eyes and force myself back before all the chaos, I can still see the glow of my childhood. My name is Michael, and before blood on the kitchen tiles, before betrayal, at 2 a.m., there were years filled with warmth, laughter, and a father whose voice still echoes in my memory. I was 12 when my dad died. A sudden heart attack stole him from us, and in that instant, the world cracked open. But before that day, life was steady. Dad wasn't just a parent. He was a compass. A financial advisor by trade, he spent evenings not in boardrooms, but at our kitchen table, teaching me how to balance numbers, how to stretch a dollar, how to think about the future. Education is the one thing nobody can take from you, Mike, he would say as we worked through math homework. At the time, it sounded like a simple piece of advice. Only years later would I understand it was prophecy. Dad believed in preparation. He set up a trust fund for my education, a safety net woven with love and foresight. That fund would become the very chain Greg tried to use to strangle me years later. But back then, it was just Dad's way of saying, I believe in your future. And I did too. After his funeral, grief became the language my mother and I spoke. She was Alice Strong, graceful with blonde hair I inherited and green eyes that mirrored my own. We leaned on each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. On hard days, I brewed tea for her. On lonely nights, she braided my hair while we watched old movies. Friday evenings were sacred popcorn black and white films, laughter filling the house until for a few hours grief loosened its grip. It's important you understand this part of my story because without it, the betrayal makes no sense. My mother and I weren't always fractured. We were once a team. I loved her fiercely, and she loved me, or so I believed. I carried Dad's lessons into my teenage years, working odd jobs from 14 onward, saving every birthday dollar, managing small budgets like puzzle pieces. By the time I reached university, majoring in finance felt like destiny. College was tough, but I thrived. I worked part-time in the financial aid office, learning more about loans grants and the real struggles families face to afford education. Every hour I worked, every spreadsheet I managed, I thought of Dad. I wanted to make him proud. I wanted his trust in me, both emotional and financial, to be justified. And through all of this, I still carried my mother with me. Care packages filled with her favorite teas, long phone calls about my classes, updates on her job at the law firm. Even from a distance, we kept our bond alive. Or at least I thought we did. Because here's the painful truth, love can blind you. When you carry someone in your heart as family, you don't see the shadows creeping in. You ignore the small changes, the shorter phone calls, the visits canceled at the last minute, the tone in their voice when they say everything is fine. Looking back, the signs were already there. My mother's independence was slipping even before Greg arrived. But at the time, I told myself she was simply busy rebuilding her life. Back then, I believed that no matter what, Mom and I were unbreakable. We had survived losing Dad, hadn't we? What else could tear us apart? But that is how betrayal works. It doesn't arrive like lightning. It creeps in slowly, reshaping the very people you trust, until one day they are strangers. My mother was still the woman who once held me through nightmares, but she was also becoming someone else, someone I couldn't yet see. If you are still with me, I want you to reflect on this. How much of the person you trust most do you truly know? Have you ever seen someone change so slowly that you didn't recognize the danger until it was too late? My story proves this. Sometimes the enemy isn't outside the walls. Sometimes it's invited in, welcomed, and given the keys to the house. And that's where we'll go next, because the man who would destroy everything didn't break into our lives. He walked in smiling with flowers in his hands. I was still in college when my mother first told me about Greg. Her voice over the phone carried a kind of excitement I hadn't heard since Dad was alive. Mike. I met someone, she said, almost girlish, as though she'd been handed a second chance at happiness. After 7 years of widowhood, she laughed again, and I wanted to believe it was real. When Thanksgiving break rolled around, I drove home to meet him. Greg Sullivan stood tall in the doorway, his salt and pepper hair catching the light. He greeted me with flowers for Mom and a handshake for me. His smile was easy, confident, the kind that made you feel seen. Over dinner, he asked me questions about my major, about finance, about my plans for the future. "Smart kid," he said, patting my shoulder. "Your mom tells me you've got a head for numbers." And just like that, I let my guard down. He seemed perfect for her. He brought color back into her cheeks, laughter back into our kitchen. By Christmas, he had moved in. By spring, they were married. I was her maid of honor, so to speak, standing by her side, truly happy to see her happy. If I noticed the speed, if I thought maybe it was too fast, I told myself not to worry. They were adults in their 40s. Why shouldn't they seize joy when it came? But love can be a mask, and charm can be a weapon. Only later would I realize that Greg's flowers were distractions, his laughter a tool, his attentiveness just camouflage. After their honeymoon, I began to see slivers of the man beneath. Greg talked about his business ventures, all the companies he had started that didn't work out because of market conditions. He was between ventures, he said, but he had big plans for a startup that would make him rich. His confidence was magnetic. Even his failures sounded like stepping stones. At least that's how Mom heard it. The first red flags weren't dramatic. They were subtle, almost invisible. The way he checked Mom's phone when she left the room. The way he commented on her friends, suggesting some weren't good influences. The way he joked about her spending habits, but his tone was just sharp enough to sting. I dismissed these moments because between them were flowers, laughter, and what seemed like genuine care. Each time I came home from college, the house felt just a little different. Less like home, more like a place where the air carried tension you couldn't quite name. "Let me ask Greg" became Mom's answer to questions she used to decide on her own. Conversations with her grew shorter, surface level. I tried to push the unease aside, convincing myself this was just adjustment. But the truth is, Greg wasn't adjusting, he was taking control. He didn't storm into our lives like a villain. He slipped in through the front door disguised as salvation. And my mother, tired of loneliness, opened her heart and our home wide to him. I often wonder how many of us ignore those first warning signs because we're desperate to believe in someone. We think he's charming, he's funny, he makes her smile again. But shadows hide behind charm, and once you let them in, they don't leave easily. As I looked back on those early months, I realized something chilling: betrayal rarely begins with violence. It begins with little compromises, little surrenders of freedom, until the cage is built and you don't even notice the bars. That cage was already forming around my mother, and I was too blind, or maybe too hopeful to see it. If you're still here with me, I'll ask you this. Have you ever ignored the small red flags because you wanted so badly for the story to have a happy ending? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might just help someone else see what they're refusing to face. Because my story didn't stop at flowers and laughter. It was only the beginning of something darker, something that would consume us both. By the time I started my senior year of college, the man who had once charmed his way into our lives was no longer a guest. He was the ruler of our home. And my mother, who once stood on her own 2 feet, who once taught me that strength was quiet, but unbreakable, now seemed to orbit entirely around Greg. I would call her after long days in the financial aid office, eager to share victories or struggles, but our conversations had become shorter, thinner, like a rope fraying thread by thread. Whenever I asked about her life, she redirected. "How are your classes?" "How's your internship?" she would say quickly, as though my questions about her happiness had become inconvenient. And whenever I suggested visiting, she had excuses: Greg's meetings, Greg's projects, Greg needing her support. The shift was subtle, but I could feel it. The woman who used to braid my hair during movie nights now answered to a new authority. "Let me ask" Greg had replaced her independent voice. Those words were small, but their weight was heavy. It meant decisions no longer belonged to her. They belonged to him. When I did come home for visits, the changes weren't just in her voice, they were in the house itself. The garden she once tended with devotion was overgrown. The smell of cigarettes lingered, though neither of us had ever smoked. Mail piled up on the entry table, and bills went unpaid. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, staring at a disconnect notice from the electric company taped to the fridge. My mother snatched it away before I could finish reading. "Just a mix-up," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Greg is handling it." But Greg's version of handling it was draining. He had quit his most recent job to focus full-time on his vague startup, which seemed to consist of endless phone calls and long lunches with invisible investors. Meanwhile, Mom was working longer hours at the law firm, stretching herself thin to cover the bills. Even then, I saw new golf clubs in the garage, designer clothes in his closet receipts. For expensive meals he claimed were business meetings. It stung. My mother, who had once worn dignity like a second skin, was now wearing worn-out blouses from my high school years, while her husband strutted in luxury. When I asked carefully if everything was all right financially, she brushed it off. "Of course, sweetie. Startups take time. You know how investments work: money in before money out." But I knew better. The numbers didn't add up. One night as I lay awake in my old bedroom during a weekend visit, I overheard them arguing. Her voice trembled as she asked how he could spend the property tax money on another business lunch. His voice boomed back, "Stop being so dramatic, Alice. If you were more supportive, maybe I could focus. I'm trying to make us rich. Is that so terrible?" That moment drilled into me like a spike. He wasn't just failing at business, he was weaponizing her loyalty, twisting her sacrifices into accusations. It wasn't about money, it was about control. And soon that control reached me. Greg began making comments about my education, dripping with resentment. "Must be nice having Daddy's money pay your way," he sneered once while I studied. I reminded him I worked 20 hours a week on top of classes, but he waved me off. "That's not real work, princess. Try the real world sometime." It wasn't jealousy, it was hostility toward independence mine and the independence my father's trust fund represented. He saw it as an untapped vault, a prize waiting to be stolen. Looking back, I see it clearly: the garden, the bills, the tension, the bruises that would soon follow. But at the time, I clung to denial. I wanted to believe my mother was still the woman who had once told me we could survive anything together. And maybe that's why I need to pause here and ask you, have you ever seen someone you love change so gradually you almost convinced yourself nothing was wrong? If you've ever felt that knot of doubt in your stomach, drop a comment below. Tell me, did you trust your instincts or did you silence them? Because ignoring mine nearly cost me everything. I wish I had trusted that knot sooner. I wish I had understood that the cracks in our home were the first signs of collapse. But I didn't. And the collapse was coming faster than I could imagine. When I came home for Thanksgiving that year, I thought I'd find comfort in the smell of turkey and the sight of my mother bustling around the kitchen. Instead, I walked into a house that no longer felt like ours. The walls seemed to close in with tension, the warmth of holidays past replaced with a strange quietness that made my skin crawl. Dinner wasn't the open, joyful celebration I remembered. Greg dictated the guest list, who could come, how long they could stay, even what conversations were appropriate. My Aunt Sarah, who had always been my mother's confidant, showed up unannounced once, only to be turned away at the door by Greg himself. "Alice isn't feeling well," he said. But I heard her voice in the background asking, "Who is it?" That image haunted me, my mother silenced, hidden in her own home. The truth was written everywhere. The friends who used to drop by were gone. The phone calls from relatives dwindled. Mom no longer had a circle, she had Greg, and he made sure of it. It's easy to miss what's happening when abuse doesn't look like bruises, at least not yet. It starts with isolation, with whispers that friends are bad influences, with casual remarks about family members being too nosy. Slowly, the net tightens until the victim doesn't realize they're trapped. I didn't see it then, but looking back, Greg was weaving that net around my mother strand by strand. The physical signs began about 6 months before the breaking point. At first, they were small. One evening, as she reached for a dish in the cabinet, I noticed her flinch, wincing in pain. "Did you hurt your back?" I asked. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, but not before I saw the finger-shaped bruises on her arm. "I'm so clumsy lately," she laughed, a sound that was hollow and wrong. "Once you notice, you can't unsee it." I began catching the way she jumped when Greg called her name, the way her body tensed when he moved suddenly. She had lost weight too much, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights she never admitted to. I remember one night vividly. I woke up thirsty and padded down the hallway to the bathroom. The door was cracked, and there on the edge of the tub sat my mother. Shoulders slumped, hands covering her face, tears slipping silently between her fingers. "Mom," I whispered, kneeling beside her, "please talk to me. Whatever is happening, we can fix it together." She wiped her eyes, forcing a smile that didn't reach them. "Every marriage has rough patches, Mike. This is nothing we can't handle. Greg is just stressed. Things will get better soon." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Back at school, I started researching. Late nights on my laptop, I read articles about domestic violence and coercive control, checking off warning signs one by one until my stomach turned. Isolation, yes. Financial control, yes. Emotional manipulation, yes. Bruises, fear, secrecy. Every box was checked. I reached out to Aunt Sarah, and she confirmed what I already feared. "I've tried to get her to stay with me," she said, voice heavy with worry. "She always has an excuse. I'm scared too, Mike, but I don't know how to help someone who won't admit they need help." I began saving what I could from my campus job, building a small emergency fund in case Mom ever needed to escape. I printed articles on safety planning, downloaded hotline numbers, even memorized what steps to take if the violence escalated. But here's the hardest part: you can prepare, you can research, you can plan and still feel helpless when the person you love refuses to see the truth. My mother was drowning, and every time I threw her a rope, she pushed it away, convinced she could swim. I wish I could tell you I forced her out then. I wish I could tell you I was braver. But the truth is, abusers don't just hold their victims with fists, they hold them with fear, shame, and twisted loyalty. And Greg had wrapped all of those around my mother until she believed leaving him would mean betraying him. That realization still cuts me because it meant she chose him over herself and eventually over me. If you've ever watched someone you love disappear behind someone else's shadow, you'll understand my helplessness. And I want to ask you, what would you do if the person you trusted most showed you bruises but insisted everything was fine? Share your thoughts. Your words might guide someone facing the same silence. Because silence is what almost destroyed us. And very soon, that silence would turn into violence that no one could deny. The silence didn't last forever. It never does. Silence in an abusive home is like the pause before a thunderstorm. It hums in your ears, pressing down on your chest, until the crash finally comes. And when it did, the signs were undeniable. It started with Greg's resentment toward me. At first, his comments about my education were sly, laced with condescension. "Must be nice to have Daddy's money pay your way," he sneered once as I sat at the kitchen table, textbooks open. I reminded him I worked 20 hours a week on top of classes, but he waved me off with that smug smirk. "That's not real work, princess. Some of us live in the real world." His tone carried venom, not jealousy. No, this was different. He saw my father's trust fund not as my protection, but as his prize. Every time he looked at me, I realized he wasn't seeing me at all. He was seeing dollar signs, the key to funding his gambling debts and failed business ventures. I should have connected the dots sooner. The disconnection notices, the endless business meetings, the new golf set, the designer suits. The math was simple: money was pouring out and nothing was coming in. But it wasn't until I overheard the late-night argument that I understood how desperate things had become. "You spent the property tax money on another lunch." My mother's voice cracked raw with fear. Greg, we're going to lose the house. Stop being so dramatic, he barked back. If you were more supportive, maybe I could focus on making us rich. After everything I've done for you, is that too much to ask? It was gaslighting at its purest. He turned her fear into her fault, her loyalty into leverage. And she let him. By then, Mom's bruises were harder to hide. Finger marks on her arms, a split lip she explained away as clumsiness. I watched her shrink physically and emotionally. The once vibrant woman who taught me to stand tall now hunched under his shadow. And then came the night that changed everything. I had planned a spa day for her birthday, something just for us to remind her of who she used to be. But the morning of Greg's car mysteriously wouldn't start, and he demanded she drive him to an urgent meeting. The next day, the car ran perfectly fine. My gift to her became another excuse for him to tighten his grip. That was when I realized his control wasn't limited to her, it extended to me too. He was deliberately cutting off our bond manufacturing emergencies to keep us apart. And the message was clear: this house, this family belonged to him. I confronted Mom about it, voice trembling. This isn't normal. You know it isn't. But she recoiled defensive. You don't understand, Michael. Marriage is compromise. He's under pressure. You'll see one day when you're older. Her words crushed me more than she knew. Because it wasn't compromise, it was captivity. Around that time, Aunt Sarah called me, her voice shaking. She'd tried to visit again only to be turned away. He said Alice was too sick, she whispered. But I heard her voice in the background asking who it was. Something's wrong, Michael. I can feel it. She was right. Holidays became orchestrated performances, every word and gesture choreographed by Greg. What used to be joyful chaos was now careful silence, everyone watching his mood like a ticking bomb. I kept researching, kept preparing, kept building a fund in case Mom needed to escape. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. She wasn't ready to leave. She was too far gone into his world, his rules, his lies. And yet part of me still believed, hoped that when the storm came, she would choose me. That when the thunder finally broke, she would stand between me and Greg, protecting her son. I was wrong. If you're listening to this, let me ask you something. Have you ever mistaken someone's silence for strength? Have you ever told yourself they were just coping, when in truth they were surrendering piece by piece? Drop your thoughts below, because silence is not survival. And your words may help someone who doesn't yet see the storm around them. The storm in our house was building. The bruises, the debt, the manipulation, they were just the first drops of rain. The real downpour was still to come. By the winter of my senior year, the storm finally revealed itself not in the form of rain, but in Greg's relentless obsession with my father's trust fund. His eyes lit up whenever the subject came close, as though that money was the lifeline to his crumbling empire of lies. And my mother, who once protected my future with pride, began parroting his desperation. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. I was walking across campus, backpack heavy with textbooks, when my phone buzzed. Michael, Mom said, her voice unnaturally high. How exactly does your father's trust work again? Alarm bells screamed inside me. She knew. I'd explained it a dozen times. The fund was airtight, restricted solely for education, overseen by trustees who released payments directly to the university. The principal couldn't be touched until after graduation. That had always been Dad's plan. His son's future was non-negotiable. Why are you asking me this now, Mom? I pressed. In the background, I heard Greg's voice. Tell him about the guaranteed return percentage. Her words rushed out in a tumble. Greg found an amazing investment. If we could just use the fund as a short loan, you'd get it back in 6 months with interest. I stopped walking. My chest tightened. That's not possible. It's illegal. The trustees would never allow it. You could lose everything. Greg grabbed the phone. His tone dripped with false warmth. Family helps family, Michael. Your mother has sacrificed everything for you. Isn't it time you gave back? That call wasn't the end. It was the beginning. What started as one request spiraled into a barrage. Daily texts, voicemails, long lectures disguised as conversations. Sometimes Greg dangled promises: 30% return, a house saved, debts erased. Other times he wielded guilt like a knife. I guess we know where your priorities lie. Not with the woman who raised you. And then came the night he showed up at my campus apartment. I opened the door to find him standing there alone, his cologne sharp, his smile predatory. Thought we should talk man to man, he said, trying to step inside. I'm not a man, Greg. I'm a student, and you're not coming in. I blocked the doorway, pulse racing. His smile faltered, eyes narrowing. Always the comedian. But let's be real, your mother's drowning. Are you going to let her lose everything while your little fund just sits there? I repeated what I'd said before. It wasn't possible. The trust was locked. Legally, morally, structurally. But he wasn't listening. He leaned in, his voice low. There are other ways. Loans in your name. Your credit's perfect, thanks to Daddy. Think how easy it would be. I slammed the door in his face, but the chill remained. Weeks later, I discovered credit inquiries on my account. They had already tried. Through a friend whose boyfriend worked at a bank, I learned the truth. Greg was drowning in gambling debt. The business opportunities were smoke. What he really owed was to men who didn't send polite letters when payments were late. And suddenly it made sense. His urgency, his rage, his determination to strip away the one shield my father had left me. It was never about opportunity. It was about survival. His, not ours. I tried calling Mom directly, desperate to get through, but my calls went unanswered. Instead, I received texts from her phone in a voice I knew wasn't hers. Stop coming between us. Greg is the only one who cares. If you loved me, you'd help. The words were daggers because they wore my mother's face. But they weren't hers. They were his. Finally, the ultimatum came: family meeting. This weekend. This ends now. His voice on the line was low, threatening, and then I heard her in the background whispering, "Please, Michael, just come." I knew what it meant. This wasn't an invitation, it was a trap. So I prepared. I gathered every document from the trust administrator proving the money was locked. I packed resources about abuse shelters. I left instructions with my roommate. If I don't check in every 2 hours, call this number. The number belonged to a campus officer who had once lectured about safety. As I drove back to my childhood home, headlights cutting through the dark, I thought about Dad. About his voice telling me education was untouchable. About his trust in me. And I promised myself that no matter what happened inside that house, I would not betray him. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that this meeting would end in blood-bone, and the kind of betrayal no child should ever face. The drive back to my childhood home felt like a march toward execution. Every mile that ticked by on the odometer tightened the knot in my stomach. I had prepared the way my father taught me, with paperwork, with facts, with undeniable proof that no amount of intimidation could unlock my trust fund. In my bag were folders from the trustees' letters, explaining the legal restrictions and resources, about shelters for domestic violence victims. It was my shield, flimsy though it felt, against the storm, waiting at 23 Maple Street. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked like a shell of what it once was. The lawn, once my mother's pride, lay overgrown and patchy. Paint peeled from the window frames, the porch light flickered like it was gasping for life. This wasn't just neglect. It was decay, the physical manifestation of Greg's grip on our lives. He opened the door with a wide grin, arms stretched as though he were greeting an old friend. "There's the financial genius of the family," he said, pulling me into a hug I didn't return. Behind him, my mother stood thin and pale, her smile as brittle as the peeling paint. Her eyes darted nervously between us. Dinner was supposed to be the family meeting, but it was a joke. Store-bought lasagna sat in aluminum trays, dishes piled in the sink, wine filling Greg's glass again and again. He rambled about family unity, about pulling together, while Mom picked at her food in silence. I tried asking her normal questions about her job, about a coworker's new grandchild, but Greg cut her off every time. "We're not here to bore Michael with office gossip," he snapped. It was a waiting game, I realized. He wanted me tired, worn down, softened by his performance of joviality and his endless drinking. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. After dinner, he ordered Mom to make coffee. His voice carried the same tone I had heard in those late-night arguments, not a request, but a command. She obeyed without hesitation. When she left the room, he disappeared into the den and returned with a manila envelope. He slid it across the table to me with a flourish. Inside were loan documents already filled with my personal information. The amount $75,000, almost the entirety of what remained in my trust. "This is a sure thing, Michael," he said, words slurring slightly from the wine. 30% return in 6 months guaranteed. I pulled out my own folder and spread the documents across the table. "This is impossible," I said calmly, my voice steadier than I felt. "The trust is ironclad. The trustees will never release those funds for this purpose. And using my information without permission, that's identity theft. I've already frozen my credit." The mask cracked. His smile faltered, his face flushed, his jaw tightened. My mother stared at the table, her hands folded in her lap, trembling. "Mom," I said, turning to her, "whatever is happening, we can fix it together. But not like this. Not through lies, not through fraud." And that was the moment the illusion shattered. Greg's hand swept across the table, sending papers flying like startled birds. His voice rose into a snarl. "Ungrateful little brat. After everything we've done for you." Wine splattered against the wall as he hurled his glass red liquid dripping like blood across the family photos. Mom gasped, but didn't move. I stood heart racing, reaching for my bag. "I think I should leave," I said, keeping my tone measured. But Greg moved faster than I imagined a drunk man could. He blocked the doorway, his frame looming. "You're not going anywhere until you sign those papers." "There are no papers I can sign that will give you that money," I shot back, my voice shaking but firm. "You can hit me, you can scream, but you can't rewrite the law." The shove came hard, his hands slamming into my shoulders, sending me stumbling into the dining table. Pain ripped through my ribs. My mother's voice broke the silence with a weak sound, half protest, half whimper, but Greg silenced her with one glare. "And here's where I want you to pause with me. Imagine yourself in that room. Imagine the weight of betrayal pressing down the man blocking your way out, the mother you trusted, frozen in silence. What would you do? Would you fight? Would you give in? Or would you gamble on survival with nothing but your will?" Because right here, this is the cliff my story balanced on. If you stay with me, I'll show you how quickly words turned to violence, how fast the room filled with blood and broken bones. But more than that, I'll show you how betrayal doesn't end where you think it does. The first shove should have been the end of it. A grown man towering over me, his rage boiling over his hands, forcing me back into the dining table, it should have broken my resolve. But instead, it lit something inside me. Fear, yes, but also fury. The realization that everything my father worked for, everything my mother once stood for, was about to be crushed under this man's greed. Greg's face twisted into something unrecognizable, his civility gone like a mask ripped away. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" He spat, his breath reeking of wine. "With your college education, your trust fund, your precious daddy's money." The first punch landed across my cheekbone. Stars exploded in my vision, and my knees buckled. I stumbled backward, trying to stay upright, but my body slammed into the step, leading down into the kitchen. My balance gave way, and I fell. The crack of bone echoed in the room like a gunshot. Pain seared through my leg as it twisted at an unnatural angle beneath me. My scream caught in my throat, choked by blood from a split lip. The tiles beneath me were cold, unyielding, as though the house itself was siding with him. Greg's boots followed. Each step was deliberate, each kick another attempt to erase me. "You could have fixed this," he growled, his foot connecting with my ribs. "One signature, Michael. One." I coughed blood onto the white tiles, the red spreading like an ugly signature of its own. And through the haze, I turned toward the one person who could stop this. "Mom," I gasped, my voice broken. "Please. Help me." She descended the steps slowly, her face unreadable. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. I thought she would step between us, that the mother who once held me through nightmares would resurface. But her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her green eyes colder than the tile beneath me. "You should have signed the loan," she said flatly. The words hit harder than Greg's fists. I clawed at the floor, dragging myself closer to her feet, my vision blurring, my heart begging her to remember who she was. When I finally reached her, my hand clutched her ankle. "Mom, please." She leaned down. For one desperate second, I thought she would lift me up, protect me. But her whisper cut deeper than any wound. "You are not my son anymore. Greg is my family now." I can't describe what broke inside me then. It was louder than the snap of my leg, sharper than the pain in my ribs. It was the sound of my foundation collapsing. The woman who had once promised I was her world had abandoned me at the feet of the man destroying us both. Greg's boot slammed into my broken leg, again pain, white-hot blinding. My body convulsed, my ears rang. And still, she stood there, watching. I looked at the kitchen clock through swollen eyes. 2:00 a.m. The night stretched endless, each second another drop of torture. And this is where survival shifted. My mother's betrayal made one thing clear: no one was coming to save me. If I wanted to live, it had to be me. Through the pain, through the blur, I noticed something. My phone cracked from the fall, lying just a few feet away. The screen still glowing faintly. Hope flickered again, Not in her eyes, not in Greg's rage, but in that fragile light on the tile. Greg turned to argue with my mother, their voices sharp, panicked whispers about what to do. "She'll call the police," Mom hissed. "She's not calling anyone," Greg snapped, grabbing a whiskey bottle from the counter. Their distraction was my chance. I dug my nails into the floor, dragging myself inch by inch toward that phone. Each scrape of my broken leg was agony, but adrenaline pushed me forward. My fingers brushed the screen just as Greg turned back. His roar shook the walls. "What do you think you're doing?" Survival isn't graceful. It's desperate, messy, brutal. I rolled onto my back, used my good leg, and kicked at his knee. The impact made him stumble, buying me precious seconds to dial with blood-slicked fingers. 911 came, the operator's voice calm and steady, the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Help me," I screamed, my words broken but clear. 23 Maple Street. He's killing me. Greg lunged his boot, connecting with my hand, sending the phone skittering across the floor. "You stupid," his face contorted with rage, veins bulging. And in that moment, I didn't know if the address had gone through, if anyone would come, if I had just risked everything for nothing. But I knew I wasn't done fighting. The sound of my phone clattering across the tile was like the last lifeline slipping away. Greg's boot had smashed it from my hand, and my heart sank. Had I said enough? Had the operator heard the address? Or was I doomed to bleed out on the kitchen floor, while my mother stood by the man destroying me? Greg yanked me up by my hair, my scalp burning as tears stung my eyes. His face hovered inches from mine, his spit spraying as he shouted, "Did they get the address? Did they—" I gasped, blood pooling in my mouth. I don't know. The truth was I didn't. In the chaos, I couldn't remember if my words had been clear or if they'd been swallowed by Greg's roar. That uncertainty wrapped itself around me like ice. Mom's voice finally cut through the room, sharp with panic. "The police, Greg. They'll be here any minute." Greg dropped me, roughly pacing the floor, his mind racing faster than his words. Then his eyes settled on me, calculation replacing rage. "We'll put her in the basement. No one will find her until we're long gone." Terror clawed up my throat. He grabbed my shattered leg and began dragging me across the floor. My vision darkened, the pain so searing I nearly lost consciousness. "No one will hear you down there," he growled. "You'll wish you had signed those papers." But survival has a strange way of lighting fires in the darkest places. As he hauled me past the kitchen island, my hand brushed the counter. My fingers closed around something solid, the wooden pepper grinder my mom always kept there. The instructor from freshman self-defense class echoed in my mind. "Use whatever you have. Fight dirty if you must. Your life depends on it." Greg bent to readjust his grip, and with every ounce of strength left in me, I swung. The pepper grinder cracked against his temple with a sickening thud. He staggered, his knee buckling from the earlier kick, and he collapsed against the counter, his head striking hard before he crumpled. The silence that followed was deafening. My breaths came in shallow gasps, the taste of iron thick on my tongue. My body screamed in pain, but my mind whispered, "Move. Don't stop now." Greg groaned, dazed, struggling to push himself up. Mom rushed down the hall, her steps frantic, her voice sharp with blame. "This is your fault, you went too far." His reply was venomous. "Me, you stood there and did nothing, you're as guilty as I am." Their voices twisted into a storm of accusation, both of them, too, consumed with pointing fingers to notice me crawling away. Their argument wasn't about me anymore, it was about saving themselves. "Pack a bag," Greg barked finally. "We're leaving before the cops get here." Mom didn't hesitate. She sprinted upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and slamming echoing through the house. I lay bleeding on the kitchen floor, every inch of me, trembling, my body, a map of fractures and bruises. I thought about Dad in that moment, how he'd taught me numbers, yes, but more than that, how he'd taught me that dignity is worth more than any fortune. Would he even recognize the woman Mom had become? Would he recognize me if this was the end? The rumble of a car engine snapped me back. Tires screeched as Greg and Mom fled into the night, leaving me broken and alone in the house that had once been our sanctuary. The silence after their departure was worse than their shouting. It pressed in on me, heavy, final. I knew I couldn't let myself slip under, not yet. I counted the ceiling tiles above me, forcing myself to stay awake. 1, 2, 3. My voice was a faint whisper, but counting gave me something to hold on to. At 37, I heard it, the faint wail of sirens cutting through the night. Louder, closer, a thread pulling me back from the brink. Red and blue lights spilled across the kitchen walls, flashing against family photos now stained with Greg's wine and my blood. Police, a voice boomed, followed by the splintering crash of the front door. Boots thundered down the hall. Anyone here? I tried to speak, but my voice cracked into a whisper. Kitchen. They found me there, curled on the tiles, bloodied but alive. Weapons lowered their presence, filled the room like salvation. A female officer knelt beside me, her hand warm and steady on mine. Ambulance is right behind us. Stay with me, okay? What's your name? Michael, I croaked, tears slipping down my face. They left. My mom and stepdad. They did this. Her grip tightened. You're safe now. We'll find them, I promise. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe her. The flashing red and blue lights followed me all the way to the hospital, painting the inside of the ambulance in surreal bursts of color. I drifted in and out my body, a battlefield of fractures and bruises. Somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, I remember the paramedic's calm voice. Stay with us, Michael. We've got you. Her words were an anchor in a sea determined to pull me under. When I woke again, the world was different. Sunlight streamed through sterile windows. Machines beeped in steady rhythms. My right leg was elevated, wrapped in plaster and metal. A brace clamped around my neck. My ribs screamed with every shallow breath. I blinked, trying to process it all, when a nurse leaned over me with kind eyes. Welcome back. I'm Valerie. You've been out for about 18 hours. That's normal, given what you've endured. Her voice was soft, but her words brought it all rushing back the kitchen floor. Greg's fists, my mother's eyes colder than the tile beneath me. The memories hit harder than any of Greg's blows. My chest heaved, panic rising, and Valerie adjusted my IV. Easy. You're safe here. He can't hurt you now. Soon after, a doctor arrived to explain the damage in terms clinical, yet devastating: a compound fracture of my right tibia, requiring a titanium rod, 3 broken ribs, facial fractures, a concussion, and internal bleeding that had miraculously stabilized without further surgery. You're lucky, he said, shaking his head. I almost laughed. Lucky wasn't the word I'd have chosen. Then the police came. A female officer from the night before sat gently at my bedside, notebook in hand. Michael, we need your statement when you're ready. My voice cracked as I recounted everything: the papers Greg forced on me, the wine glass shattering the fists, the kicks, and worst of all, the moment my mother whispered that I was no longer her son. The words scraped my throat like glass. The officers exchanged a glance I couldn't read. We've issued alerts for both Gregory and Alice Sullivan, the male officer said. Their car was found abandoned at a bus station 2 states north, but we will find them. Hearing my mother's name alongside Greg's felt like another fracture, this one invisible, but deeper than bone. Not long after, a social worker arrived. She spoke gently but firmly, outlining steps for protection, an emergency restraining order against both Greg and my mother, resources for victims of domestic abuse support groups. The surrealness of it all struck me: how quickly my mother had shifted from guardian to defendant. How my survival now depended on laws designed to protect me from the very people who should have shielded me first. Then Zoe walked in, my roommate, my best friend. She rushed to my side, tears brimming as she set down a bag with clothes and my laptop. I knew something was wrong when you didn't check in, she whispered, gripping my hand tightly. When the police called this morning, I thought her voice cracked. Her presence broke the dam inside me. For the first time since the attack, I sobbed, not from physical pain, but from the avalanche of betrayal, grief, and relief. My ribs screamed, but I couldn't stop. Zoe stayed with me, steady and unflinching, until the storm inside me ebbed. Later, the dean of my university called. They were arranging for me to finish coursework remotely, accommodations for exams and deadlines, even financial assistance for medical expenses. Focus on healing, she told me. We'll make sure you graduate. Her words carried a weight of compassion I hadn't expected, and for the first time I felt the faint stirrings of a truth: I wasn't alone. Still, the nights in the hospital were long. Sleep brought nightmares. My mother's whisper echoing, Greg's boots slamming into my ribs, the crack of my own bones. Nurses checked on me, therapists visited, even a janitor paused nightly to ask, "How you holding up, kid?" Each small act chipped away at the darkness, reminding me of the humanity still left in the world. But the deepest wound wasn't on my body, it was inside me. I kept replaying my mother's face, her cold eyes as she chose him over me. No surgeon could stitch that closed. No titanium rod could support the weight of that betrayal. And yet even in that despair, a thought kept burning: I survived. And if I survived, then maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild. And here's where I need you to lean in with me. Survival isn't the end of the story, it's only the beginning. What comes after the choices, the healing, the reclaiming of freedom, that's the hardest fight of all. Stay with me, because the trial, the sentences, and the road back to life are coming. And so is the question that will haunt me forever: can you forgive someone who watched you bleed? The first days after surgery blurred together: bright hospital lights, the sting of IV needles, and a carousel of doctors explaining things I only half heard. But eventually, the fog lifted enough for reality to land like a weight on my chest. Greg and my mother were still out there, somewhere, breathing free air while I lay strapped together with titanium and stitches. 3 weeks later, the call finally came. I was sitting in my hospital bed, staring at a copy of Jane Eyre a former teacher had brought me when the phone rang. A detective's voice on the other end. "We've found them. A motel 2 states away. They'll be extradited back to face charges." My heart hammered, not from fear this time, but from something colder: closure, maybe, though it tasted bitter. I had imagined this moment countless times, them dragged in handcuffs, justice served. But instead of satisfaction, I felt hollow. Their bail hearing was my first chance to see them again. Against my doctor's advice, I insisted on attending. I needed to face them not as their victim, but as a survivor. I hobbled into the courtroom on crutches, surgical scars still raw. The room smelled of old wood and disinfectant. My hands shook, but I forced myself forward. Greg sat in an orange jumpsuit, his arrogance stripped bare. Without his tailored suits and smug grin, he looked smaller, almost pitiful. My mother sat separately, her own lawyer whispering to her. She didn't look at me, not once. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table green irises dulled to gray. Greg's attorney argued he had no prior violent offenses, painting him as a man who lost control under financial stress. My mother's lawyer painted her as another victim, coerced, terrified. The words made bile rise in my throat. Yes, she had been trapped, but she had also chosen. She had stood there while I bled, whispered that I was no longer her son. No legal defense could erase that. The judge set bail so high, neither could pay it. They would remain in custody until trial. For the first time since that night, I slept a little easier. As weeks passed, evidence piled up: texts from Greg threatening me, financial records, showing their attempts to siphon money from my trust, medical documentation of my injuries. Each new piece was another nail in the coffin of their defense. Greg cracked first. He accepted a plea deal: 15 years for attempted murder, financial fraud charges folded in. The man who once boasted about building empires would now be building nothing but prison routines. My mother fought longer. She claimed coercion, painting herself as a victim under Greg's thumb. Her trial strategy was to frame her silence, her betrayal, as fear. And yes, part of me believed she was afraid. But fear doesn't excuse standing by while your child is beaten half to death. Fear doesn't excuse whispering, "You are not my son." Therapy sessions became my lifeline. Dr. Levine, my therapist, helped me untangle the knot of emotions, rage, grief, and confusingly flashes of empathy. She was abused, yes, Dr. Levine said. But she also failed catastrophically in her duty to protect you. Both can be true. I wrestled with that. At night, my dreams mixed childhood memories with the horror of that kitchen. Mom singing me to sleep became Mom watching me bleed. 2 versions of her irreconcilable colliding in my mind. I started journaling letters to her I'd never send, some filled with rage. "How could you?" Some filled with sorrow, "I miss you." Others with questions that had no answers. Was I ever really your son, or only a weight tied to Greg's approval? Writing them didn't fix the pain, but it gave me somewhere to put it so it wouldn't rot inside me. The day Greg was sentenced, I felt a strange satisfaction. The courtroom echoed with the sound of the gavel, final and sharp. But my mother's case loomed like a shadow. Would she take responsibility or hide behind excuses until the end? And here's where I need you to pause with me. Imagine facing the person who gave you life, who once kissed your scraped knees, and realizing you must now testify against her. Could you look into her eyes and tell the world she betrayed you? Because that's what came next. And the question wasn't just whether justice would be served, but whether I could survive the answer. The day of my mother's sentencing felt heavier than the titanium rod in my leg. Greg was already locked away, his arrogance broken into a 15-year sentence. But my mother's case, that was different. This wasn't just about justice, it was about closure, about staring into the eyes that once read me bedtime stories and admitting they had become the eyes of a stranger. I entered the courtroom on crutches, scars still fresh, my limp permanent. Every step echoed in the chamber like a drumbeat. The prosecutor had prepared me for this moment. You can make a victim impact statement. You don't have to, but it's your right. I knew I had to. My mother sat across the room, thinner than ever, clad in a muted jumpsuit. For the first time since that night, her gaze lifted. Our eyes met. Hers brimmed with tears, but I refused to let mine fall. When the judge invited me to speak, I gripped the podium, knuckles white, and steadied my breath. The physical injuries will heal. I began, my voice steady, though my chest trembled. The broken bones, the concussion, the scars. Doctors can repair those things, but what cannot be repaired so easily is the trust that shattered that night. I looked directly at her, refusing to glance away. When a mother watches her child beaten and does nothing, it breaks something fundamental. When a mother whispers that her child is no longer hers, it does more than wound the body, it destroys the soul. My words filled the silence, bouncing off the walls until they seemed to echo back at me. I continued, voice growing stronger. I have studied trauma bonds and coercive control. I understand how manipulation works, how abusers isolate and erode their victims. I understand how you were trapped, Mom, but understanding does not equal absolution. You were a victim, but you also became my abuser when you chose silence over protection. For the first time, tears streamed down her face. She shook her head as if to deny it, but I pressed on. I am rebuilding my life without you in it. That is the cost of your choices. Maybe one day I will forgive you, maybe not, but reconciliation. That is not yours to ask for. That is mine to decide. I stepped back from the podium, legs shaking, heart pounding. The judge's gavel came down with finality: 5 years in prison, mandatory counseling, and supervised rehabilitation. It wasn't much compared to Greg's 15, but it was enough to sever the illusion that she could return to me unchanged. Weeks later, her lawyer sent me a letter. She had written to me seeking forgiveness, maybe even connection. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I placed it in a drawer, still sealed, because forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Dr. Levine reminded me, forgiveness may come, but reconciliation requires trust. And trust, Michael, must be earned. She did not earn it. In therapy, I tried to hold both truths. My mother was once my greatest ally, and my mother stood silent as I bled. Both versions existed. Both were real. Learning to live with that contradiction became my hardest work. Meanwhile, life forced me forward. Physical therapy taught me to walk again, step by agonizing step. Pain became my teacher, reminding me with every movement that healing is not linear. My scars faded from angry red to silver lines. Badges of survival, not shame. But the deeper work was inside. Nights still brought nightmares. Days brought waves of grief when I least expected them. Yet with each journal entry, each therapy session, each small victory, like making it across my apartment without crutches, I built something new. And here's where I want you to pause. Imagine being asked to choose between forgiving and forgetting. Could you sit in front of the person who birthed you and say, you no longer have a place in my life? Because that was my choice. And it's a choice survivors everywhere must face. Comment below, what would you do in my shoes? Could you forgive, or would you walk away forever? The sentencing closed one chapter. But what came after the rebuilding, the redefining of family, the choice to transform pain into purpose that became the beginning of another? The gavel fell, and just like that, it was over. Greg was locked away. My mother was sentenced. The courtroom emptied, leaving me standing alone with my crutches, staring at the space where she had sat. 5 years. That was her punishment. But for me, the sentence was lifelong. Not because of what Greg had done, but because of what she hadn't. When I walked out into the cold air that day, the wind cut through my coat sharp as glass. Yet it also carried a strange freedom. For the first time in years, I knew Greg couldn't touch me again. And my mother, whatever she had become, was no longer in control of my life. But survival isn't a happy ending, it's a beginning. Recovery stretched before me like an unmarked road. My body was a constant reminder. The limp from the rod in my leg, the ache in my ribs on cold mornings, the way my jaw clicked when I chewed all scars of that night. I had to relearn the simplest things, walking across a room, climbing stairs, even trusting my reflection in the mirror. Yet, with each step, I reclaimed something. Zoe, my roommate, moved in with me full-time during recovery. She decorated the apartment with streamers the day I walked unassisted for the first time. To walking under your own power, she said, raising a cookie like a toast. Her joy made me believe mine was possible too. I adopted a rescue dog, a shepherd mix named Cooper. He had scars of his own, abandoned and mistreated before I found him. We became survivors together. His bark at every creak of the door gave me peace. His steady presence at night silenced the worst nightmares. Work also gave me direction. After graduation, I took a job with a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors rebuild financial independence. Many victims stay because they simply can't afford to leave. That was a truth my father had understood when he set up my trust fund. Now, I used his gift to help others find the same freedom. Every time a woman opened her first bank account, every time a survivor secured housing, I felt like Dad's voice whispered, "Education is the one thing nobody can take from you." Holidays became my own to reinvent. No more tense Thanksgivings under Greg's rule. Instead, I hosted Friendsgiving for people with nowhere safe to go. At Christmas, I volunteered at a women's shelter baking cookies for children who were learning that family could be chosen. These new traditions didn't erase the grief, but they gave me something stronger: hope. Art therapy became another path. I had never seen myself as creative, but splashing paint on canvas gave shape to emotions too jagged for words. Rage, grief, betrayal, even flickers of hope, they all found a place in the colors and clay. Slowly, my pain turned into expression, something I could set aside instead of carrying forever. Through support groups, I found others like me, people who knew the language of trauma without translation. We understood each other's silences, each other's flinches at sudden noises. Healing wasn't lonely anymore. And yes, eventually I let myself date again. Ethan, a law student, wasn't flashy. He didn't make grand promises. What he gave me was consistency, respect. The first time a nightmare woke me, he didn't rush to hold me. He asked, "Do you want space or comfort?" That question, that choice, was more healing than any embrace. My mother eventually sent another letter through her lawyer. I still haven't opened it. Maybe I never will. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two different roads, and I'm walking only one of them. 1 year after the attack, I lit 2 candles. One for the boy I had been, the boy who believed his mother would always protect him, and one for the man I was becoming, scarred, yes, but stronger in the broken places. And now I tell my story, not to relive the pain, but to remind others that survival is possible, that even when family fails you, you can choose a new one, that silence does not have to be the end. If you've walked through betrayal, if you've rebuilt from ashes, I invite you to share your story too. Your voice matters. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, raw, unfiltered, and real, make sure you stay with this channel. Because healing doesn't end here. It continues one story at a time. When I look back now, I don't just see the night of blood and broken bones. I see a turning point. The night wasn't the end of me, it was the beginning of someone new. Healing has not been simple. It hasn't been linear. There are still days when the scars ache, when certain sounds make my chest tighten, when memories slip into my dreams uninvited. But those days don't define me anymore. They remind me of what I survived, of the strength that rose up in me when everything else fell away. I've learned that family isn't only the people who share your blood. Family can be the friend who stays by your bedside, the dog who refuses to leave your side, the stranger who looks you in the eye and says you're not alone. Family can be chosen, and sometimes it must be. The trust fund my father created for my education became more than tuition. It became a shield one Greg could never take, one my mother tried to surrender but failed. Today, I honor my father by using that same resource to help other survivors rebuild their lives. What was nearly stolen has become a foundation for freedom. If there's one truth my story leaves behind, it's this: survival isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing to rise even after you've been broken. It's about saying, I will not be defined by betrayal. I will not be silenced by pain. And if you're listening to this right now, if you've faced your own storm, remember this. You are stronger than you think, and your story isn't over. It's just waiting for you to take the pen back and write it on your own terms.